Billy Collins, of course, as I said, it's 10 volumes of poetry. You were the Poet Laureate of the United States. I looked you up, and there was an incredibly long list of awards that you have won. I'll just cut to the, most important of them. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989, and then he Purple Heart and the Silver Star when he was at the 101st Airborne Division at Da Nang. I've always wanted to be a fiction writer. I was just trying to see what it felt like. Billy Collins, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Now, balancing act. Good evening. I'm a little slow because of stepping up onto the podium increases the altitude by 1 foot. And that is perceptible and palpable. You know of Sleepless in Seattle. I feel breathless in Aspen. So I'm great to be here. I want to thank just quickly the people who invited me, and Adrian and Mo and Jamie and Adrian, who brought me to the brink of verklempt a few minutes ago. So thank you for that. And to the emerging writers, I encourage you to continue your emergence. As if you had a choice. So I'm going to read some poems. I want to read a poem that starts with a poem about being someone who is aware of his readers, and it's a poem called "You Reader." I wonder how you are going to feel when you find out that I wrote this instead of you. That it was I who got up early to sit in the kitchen and mention with a pen the rain-soaked windows, the ivy wallpaper, and the goldfish circling in its bowl. Go ahead and turn aside, bite your lip and tear out the page, but listen, it was just a matter of time before one of us happened to notice the unlit candles and the clock humming on the wall. Plus, nothing happened that morning. A song on the radio, a car whistling along the road outside, and I was only thinking about the shakers of salt and pepper that were standing side by side on a placemat. I wondered if they had become friends after all these years, or if they were still strangers to one another, like you and I, who managed to be known and unknown to each other at the same time. Me at this table with a bowl of pears, you leaning in a doorway somewhere near some blue hydrangeas, reading this. Thank you. I'm going to introduce the first animal of the evening. It's a poem called "Another Reason Why I Don't Keep a Gun in the House." The neighbor's dog will not stop barking. He is barking the same high rhythmic bark that he barks every time they leave the house. They must switch him on their way out. The neighbor's dog will not stop barking. I close all the windows in the house and put on a Beethoven symphony, full blast. But I can still hear him muffled under the music, barking, barking, barking. And now I can see him sitting in the orchestra, his head raised confidently, as if Beethoven had included a part for Barking Dog. When the record finally ends, he is still barking, sitting there in the oboe section barking, his eyes fixed on the conductor, who is entreating him with his baton, while the other musicians listen in respectful silence to the famous Barking Dog solo, that endless coda that first established Beethoven as an innovative genius. Thank you very much. That poem is not a new poem by any stretch of the imagination. So that dog is either dead or the oldest dog in the world. So silenced in any case. So here's a poem called 1956. In the old joke, the marriage counselor tells the couple who never talks anymore to go to a jazz club, because at a jazz club, everyone talks during the bass solo. But of course, no one starts talking just because of a bass solo, or any other solo for that matter. The quieter bass solo just reveals the people in the club who have been talking all along. The same ones you can hear on some well-known recordings. Bill Evans, for example, who is opening a new door on the piano while some guy chats up his date at one of the little tables in the back. I have listened to that album so many times, I can anticipate the moment of his drunken laugh, as if it were a strange note in the music. And so, anonymous man, you have become part of my listening, a romance lost in the past, and a reminder somehow that each one of the trio has died since then, and maybe so have you, and sadly, maybe she. Thank you. This is just a little sketch with a big title. The title is 16 Years Old. I helped bring in the hay on my Uncle John's farm with 2 French-Canadian workers. None of us expected the massing thunderheads to open their doors so suddenly that we would have to drop our rakes and run across the field to a shelter and stand there side by side under its tin roof, looking out through a shiny curtain of rain. We had never spent any time together except for the haying, raking it into piles and pitchforking it up into an old truck. But now there was nothing to do but watch and listen to the downpour, and nothing to say either, after the cigarettes had been offered around and lit one by one with the flame of a single match. Here's a little poem for you English majors. It's called A Note to Thomas Stearns Eliot, a note to T.S. Eliot. I just dared to eat a really big peach, as ripe as it could be, and I have on a pair of plaid shorts and a blue t-shirt with a hole in it, and little rivers of juice are running down my chin now and dripping onto the pool deck. What is your problem, man? Anyway, I was talking back to him. Do I dare eat a peach? We took that so seriously when we were in school. Just eat the peach, man. Carpe peach. I had another little, a little English major poem called The Widow, which is actually a sort of sad poem. The Widow. This is just to say, I'm sorry, it's called The Widower. That's a big difference if you happen to be one of those. The widower. This is just to say, this morning I ate the plums that I had been saving for breakfast. Okay. See, that's this English major out there. All right. Here's a poem about an American ornithological phenomenon. That's the way it starts anyway. It's called The Sandhill Cranes of Nebraska. I better see what time it is, because I have about 9 hours of poetry here. All gold. The Sandhill Cranes of Nebraska. Too bad you weren't here 6 months ago, was a lament I heard on my visit to Nebraska. You could have seen the astonishing spectacle of the sandhill cranes, thousands of them feeding and even dancing on the shores of the Platte River. There was no point in pointing out the impossibility of my being there then, because I happened to be somewhere else. So I nodded and put on a look of mild disappointment, if only to be part of the commiseration. It was the same look I remember wearing about 6 months ago in Georgia, when I was told that I had just missed the spectacular annual outburst of azaleas, brilliant against the green backdrop of spring. And the same in Vermont 6 months before that, when I arrived shortly after the magnificent foliage had gloriously peaked, Mother Nature, as she is called, having touched the hills with her many-colored brush, a phenomenon that occurs, like the others, around the same time every year, when I am apparently off in another state, stuck in a motel lobby with the local paper and a styrofoam cup of coffee, busily missing God knows what. The poet Howard Nemeroff had a name for that phenomenon. He made up a new word, and he made up the transitive verb to azaleate. And to azaleate means to commiserate needlessly with some visitor about a local natural phenomenon that they just missed because they arrived too late, or they will miss because they're leaving too early. I wonder if you know Howard Nemeroff's great 2-line poem entitled Bacon and Eggs. The chicken contributes, but the pig gives his all. Nothing like a little truth in a poem. Okay, let's just see. Again, I was down at the Golden Dragon earlier, and so this could be a little slow in my delivery here. Here's an indebtedness. There is no more explicit indebtedness that a poet can pay than when he or she writes a poem that is a version of a previous poem by another poet. And so, and there's an etiquette involved in doing this. One uses the same title, and then, as most of you know, you then write you write the phrase after Neruda or after Emily Dickinson under that to acknowledge the source. So I wanted to write a version of a beautiful poem by the Chinese poet Li Po. Those are my after dinner notes, so that's okay. And his poem is called Drinking Alone. Beautiful, poignant poem. I thought I could do a kind of modernized version of that. So I dutifully wrote Drinking Alone on a piece of paper, and then I wrote After Li Po, and then I had nothing to say. I just sort of stared at the expression After Li Po. Drinking Alone, After Li Po. This is not after Li Po the way the state is after me for neglecting to pay all my taxes, nor the way I am after the woman in front of me at the long line at the post office. Li Po, I am not saying after you as I stand holding open one of the heavy glass doors that divide the centuries in a long corridor of glass doors. No, the only way this is after you is in the way they say it's just one thing after another. Like the way I will pause to raise a glass of wine to you after I finish writing this poem. So let me get back to sitting in the wind alone among the pines with a pencil in my hand. After all, you had your turn, and mine will soon be done. Then someone else will sit here after me. Thank you so much. Here's a poem, and I don't write anything close to confessional poetry, but something is confessed in this poem called Cheerios. One bright morning in a restaurant in Chicago, as I waited for my eggs and toast, I opened the Tribune only to discover that I was the same age as Cheerios. Indeed, I was a few months older than Cheerios, for today the newspaper announced was the 70th birthday of Cheerios, whereas mine had occurred earlier in the year. Already I could hear them whispering behind my stooped and threadbare back, "Why, that dude's older than Cheerios." The way they used to say, "Why, that's as old as the hills." Only the hills are much older than Cheerios or any American breakfast cereal. And more noble and enduring are the hills, I surmised, as a bar of sunlight illuminated my orange juice. Thank you very much. And this is, I got a number of poems that are based on listening to conversation and just hearing little tics and linguistic habits that sneak into our language and our conversation. And this poem is called After the Funeral. When you told me that you needed a drink and not just a drink like a drink of water, I steered you by the elbow into a corner bar, which turned out to be a real bar. Dim and nearly empty with little tables in the back where we drank and agreed that the funeral was a real funeral, complete with a mass, incense, and tons of eulogies. You know, I've always considered Tom a real friend, you said, lifting your drink to your lips. And I agreed that Tom was much more than just an ordinary friend. We also concurred that Angela's black dress was elegant, but not like elegant, just elegant enough. And a few hours later, when the bartender brought yet another round of whiskeys to our table in the corner, we recognized by his apron and by his mighty girth that he was more than just a bartender. A true bartender was what he was, we decided, with the respectful clink of our drinks, amber in a chink of afternoon light. Thank you so much. So we have writers of many genres here, but poets are the only ones who are on the receiving end of what I'm about to describe in this poem. And we get it all the time. So stop doing it. Oh, I haven't told you what it is yet. All right. It's called the suggestion box. It began fairly early in the day, at the coffee shop as it turned out, when the usual waitress said, "I bet you're going to write a poem about this," after she had knocked a cup of coffee into my lap. Then later in the morning, I was told by a student that I should write a poem about the fire drill that was going on as we all stood on the lawn outside our building. And the afternoon, a woman I barely knew said, "You could write a poem about that," pointing to a dirigible that was passing slowly overhead. And if all that were not enough, a friend turned to me as we walked past a man whose face was covered with tattoos and said, "I see a poem coming." Why is everyone being so helpful? I wondered that evening by the shore of a lake. Maybe I should write a poem about all the people who think they know what I should be writing poems about. It was just then, in the fading light, that I spotted a pair of ducks emerging from a cluster of reeds to paddle out to open water. The female glancing back over her russet shoulder, just in time to see me searching my pockets for a pen. I knew it, she quacked, with a bit of a brogue. But who can blame you for following your heart, she went on. Now go write a lovely poem about me and the mister. That's what we do. We get the talking duck in there. That's what poetry is all about. And here is a, you don't know, I mean, I don't know where I'm going in these poems, and you're nodding inwardly, saying that you've made that abundantly clear. But, in the midst of a poem like that, as you're, kind of getting through it, suddenly, a duck appears, and the duck saves you. I mean, it's the duck announces that you can end with me. Here's a poem on the thorny subject of adolescence. And there's a speaker and a specific recipient of the address. And it's titled, "To My Favorite 17-Year-Old High School Girl." Do you realize that if you had started building the Parthenon on the day you were born, you would be all done in only one more year? Of course, you couldn't have done that alone, so never mind. You're fine just as you are. You are loved for simply being yourself. But did you know that at your age, Judy Garland was pulling down $150,000 a picture? Joan of Arc was leading the French army to victory, and Blaise Pascal had cleaned up his room? No, wait, I mean he had invented the calculator. Of course, there will be time for all that later in your life, after you come out of your room and begin to blossom, or at least pick up all your socks. For some reason, I keep remembering that Lady Jane Grey was Queen of England when she was only 15. But then she was beheaded, so never mind her as a role model. But a few centuries later, when he was your age, Franz Schubert was doing the dishes for his family. But that did not keep him from composing 2 symphonies, 4 operas, and 2 complete masses as a youngster. But of course, that was in Austria at the height of Romantic lyricism, not here in the suburbs of Cleveland. Frankly, who cares if Annie Oakley was a crack shot at 15, or if Maria Callas debuted as Tosca at 17? We think you are special by just being you, playing with your food and staring into space. By the way, I lied about Schubert doing the dishes, but that doesn't mean he never helped out around the house. Thank you very much. Well, let's get back to some dogs here. There's some amazing dogs walking around here today. Of the 10th magnitude of dog. Great Danes and Newfoundland, whatever they're called, Newfies, Newfoundland Newfies. Here's a poem, a little soliloquy spoken by a dog, and you can imagine it written by the dog if you like. And the dog is thinking about one of the aspects of dog ownership, which is sort of a questionable word for the relationship between a dog and a human, ownership. It's only 12 lines long, It's called A Dog on His Master. As young as I look, I am growing older faster than he. 7-to-1 is the ratio they tend to say. Whatever the number, I will pass him one day and take the lead, the way I do on our walks in the woods. And if this ever manages to cross his mind, it would be the sweetest shadow I have ever cast on snow or grass. Okay, you made a little sound there, which is a nice sound. I like that, you know. But it reveals something about the poem. It reveals that the poem has lost ironic traction. And has slid backwards into a ditch of sentimentality. So, it's not a bad thing, really, but that knowing that writing about an obsessive topic of mine, writing about dogs, carries that risk, I decided at one point I would try to write a poem that was absolutely dry-eyed, kind of clear, cold look at the subject that would not cause you to make that sound. And the poem is called The Revenant, and that revenant is a big Latinate word for a ghost that comes back to visit you. The Revenant. I am the dog you put to sleep, as you like to call the needle of oblivion. Come back to tell you this simple thing. I never liked you. When I licked your face, I thought of biting off your nose. When I watched you toweling yourself dry, I wanted to leap and unman you with a snap. I resented the way you moved, your lack of animal grace, the way you would sit in a chair to eat, a napkin on your lap, a knife in your hand. I would have run away, but I was too weak, a trick you taught me while I was learning to sit and heel, and greatest of insults, shake hands without a hand. I admit the sight of the leash would excite me, but only because it meant I was about to smell things you had never touched. You do not want to believe this, but I have no reason to lie now. I hated the car, hated the rubber toys, disliked your friends and worse, your relatives. The jingling of my tags drove me mad. You always scratched me in the wrong place. All I ever wanted from you was food and water in my metal bowls. While you slept, I watched you breathe as the moon rose in the sky. It took all my strength not to raise my head and howl. Now I am free of the collar, free of the yellow raincoat, monogrammed sweater, the absurdity of your lawn. And that is all you need to know about this place, except what you already supposed and are glad it did not happen sooner, that everyone here can read and write, the dogs in poetry, the cats and all the others in prose. So we'll let the dog have the last word on the poetry and prose dispute there. Walter, let me read this poem for you, and you others can listen in here. And a sort of nostalgic farewell to the typewriter, and the title is Royal Aristocrat, which was the name of a typewriter. One I had. I never thought twice about it when I was using it, but Royal Aristocrat seems kind of redundant in a way. I mean, kind of piling it on a bit. I mean, the aristocrat would be enough, or the royal, but this was the royal aristocrat. My old typewriter used to make so much noise, I had to put a cushion of newspaper beneath it late at night so as not to wake the whole house. Even if I closed the study door and typed a few words at a time, the best way to work anyway, the clatter of keys was still so loud that the gray and yellow bird would wince in its cage. Some nights I could even see the moon frowning down at me through the winter trees. That was 20 years ago, yet as I write this with my soft lead pencil, I can still hear that distinctive sound like small arms fire across a border, one burst after another, as my wife turned in her sleep. I was a single monkey trying to type the opening lines of my Hamlet, more often doing nothing more than ironing pieces of paper in the platen, then wrinkling them into balls to flick into the wicker basket. At least, still, I was making noise, adding to the great secretarial din, that chorus of clacking and bells, thousands of desks receding into the past. And that was more than can be said for the mute rooms of furniture, the speechless cruets of oil and vinegar, and the tall, silent hedges surrounding the house. Such deep silence on those nights, just the sound of my typing, and a few stars singing a song their mother sang when they were mere babies in the sky. Thank you. And a good poem to, companion poem to that is another poem that focuses on a sort of fetish object and one of carrying whiffs of nostalgia. And it's a poem called The Death of the Hat, which just started out by, it led to a greater subject or a broader subject, but it started out just by trying to, almost the death of the hat. Right. The near death of the hat, with a few exceptions. But it just harkens back to that time when men in cities all were obliged to wear really fedora hats. The death of the hat. Once every man wore a hat. In the ashen newsreels, the avenues of cities are broad rivers flowing with hats. The ballpark swelled with thousands of straw hats, brims and bands, rows of men smoking and cheering in shirt sleeves. Hats were the law. They went without saying. You noticed a man in a crowd without a hat. You bought them from Adams or Dobbs, who branded your initials in gold on the inside band. Trolleys crisscrossed the city. Steamships sailed in and out of the harbor. Men with hats gathered on the docks. There was a person to block your hat, and a hat-checked girl to mind it while you had a drink or ate a steak with peas and a baked potato. In your office stood a hat rack. The day war was declared, everyone in the street was wearing a hat, and they were wearing hats when a ship loaded with men and women sank in the icy sea. My father wore one to work every day and returned home carrying the evening paper, the winter chill radiating from his overcoat. But today we go bareheaded into the winter streets, stand hatless on frozen platforms. Today the mailboxes on the roadside and the spruce trees behind the house wear cold white hats of snow. Mice scurry from the stone walls at night in their thin fur hats to eat the birdseed that has spilled. And now my father, after a life of work, wears a hat of earth, and on top of that, a lighter one of cloud and sky, a hat of wind. Thank you. Thank you. Well, let's see here. A couple of poems. Well, how about just a couple of short poems here? Here's a tiny poem called, another poem that is reacting to a way of a speech habit. Actually, I don't even need to read this. I know it, but where is it anyway? But it's a poem. It's only 8 lines long. It's called "Oh My God!" Exclamation point! Oh my God! Not only in church and nightly by their bedsides do young girls pray these days. Wherever they go, prayer is woven into their talk like a bright thread of awe. Even at the pedestrian mall, outbursts of praise spring unbidden from their glossy lips. Thank you. And here's a 4-line poem, which makes no sense without the title, and the title is Divorce. Divorce. Once, 2 spoons in bed. Now, tying forks across a granite table, and the knives they have hired. Yeah, that's supposed to be painful, yeah. Okay. Well, speaking of divorce, here's a poem called Hangover. I think we're all old enough to hear this poem. Hangover. If I were crowned emperor this morning, every child who is playing Marco Polo in the swimming pool of this motel, shouting the name Marco Polo back and forth, Marco Polo, Marco Polo, would be required to read a biography of Marco Polo, a long one with fine print, as well as a history of China and of Venice, the birthplace of the venerable explorer Marco Polo. Marco Polo, after which each child would be quizzed by me, then executed by drowning, regardless how much they managed to retain about the glorious life and times of Marco Polo. Thanks. This is a sonnet, and it's called "The Golden Years." It's because the narrator speaker is a retired fellow, and it's a reaction to the names of various condominium developments or gated communities that seem to pop up overnight in many places around this country, most of which bear the name, and their names usually carry a whiff of the rustic and the pastoral, and they often involve an animal. So you have like Deer Hollow and Beaver Meadow and that kind of thing. And it struck me at some point that, well, these are precisely the animals that were banished from their habitat in order to build these houses. So then the signs started to carry this sort of sad undersong. At any rate, the golden years. All I do these drawn-out days is sit in my kitchen at Pheasant Ridge, where there are no pheasants to be seen, and last time I looked, no ridge. I could drive over to Quail Falls and spend the day there playing bridge, but the lack of a falls and the absence of quail would only remind me of Pheasant Ridge. I know a widow at Fox Run and another with a condo at Smoky Ledge. One of them smokes and neither can run. So I'll stick to the pledge I made to Midge. Who frightened the fox and bulldoze the ledge, I ask in my kitchen at Pheasant Ridge. I'm conducting this really interesting workshop with some really smart younger poets, and we were talking about how a little subject matter goes a long way. And I want to read a poem, or maybe two, in which I'm pretty much free of subject matter. I know that, I think Flaubert said he wanted to, if he could write another book, he wanted to write a book about nothing. And that's the goal of mine in a way. It's a poem called Hippos on Holiday. Hippos on Holiday is really not the title of a movie, but if it were, I would be sure to see it. I love their short legs and big heads, the whole hippo look. Hundreds of them would frolic in the mud of a wide, slow-moving river, and I would eat my popcorn in the dark of a neighborhood theater. When they opened their enormous mouths lined with big stubby teeth, I would drink my enormous Coke. I would be both in my seat and in the water playing with the hippos, which is the way it is with a truly great movie. Only a mean-spirited reviewer would ask, on holiday from what? Okay. All right. Let's see. Well, here's a poem. The high watermark for this kind of activity is, well, it's will occur in about mid-August when children all over the country are making these things. A poem called "The Lanyard." And one thing I do in this poem is I try to roll the poem back to where the poem got started in my head and kind of let you in on the beginning of that. The Lanyard. The other day, as I was ricocheting slowly off the pale blue walls of this room, bouncing from typewriter to piano, from bookshelf to an envelope lying on the floor, I found myself in the L section of the dictionary, where my eyes fell upon the word lanyard. No cookie nibbled by a French novelist could send one more suddenly into the past. A past where I sat at a workbench at a camp by a deep Adirondack lake, learning how to braid thin plastic strips into a lanyard, a gift from my mother. I had never seen anyone use a lanyard, or wear one if that's what you did with them, but that did not keep me from crossing strand over strand again and again until I had made a boxy red and white lanyard for my mother. She gave me life and milk from her breasts, and I gave her a lanyard. She nursed me in many a sick room, lifted teaspoons of medicine to my lips, set cold face cloths on my forehead, and then led me out into the airy light and taught me to walk and swim, and I in turn presented her with a lanyard. Here are thousands of meals, she said, and here is clothing and a good education. And here is your lanyard, I replied, which I made with a little help from a counselor. Here is a breathing body and a beating heart, strong legs, bones and teeth, and 2 clear eyes to read the world, she whispered. And here I said, is the lanyard I made at camp. And here I wish to say to her now is a smaller gift, not the archaic truth that you can never repay your mother, but the rueful admission that when she took the 2-tone lanyard from my hands, I was as sure as a boy could be that this useless, worthless thing I wove out of boredom would be enough to make us even. It's a very delicate transaction, that. I went to a really simple camp. You could make it a potholder or a lanyard. That was about it. I had friends who went to more exclusive camps, and they had a wider range of gifts they could give to their parents, because you had to bring something back that you made to your parent to thank them for getting rid of you for the summer. This was a token of gratitude. But these other kids could make cups, like ceramics, right, in something called a kiln. I'd never heard the word kiln, at that age. I thought it was like the past pluperfect for kill or something. But these coffee cups, the kids were too inept at their age to make handles for them, so they were equally useless as the lanyard. And one mother told me that these handleless coffee cups are called lanyard holders. That's where the lanyard is stored for safekeeping. Where's the lanyard? It's in the lanyard holder cup. The one without the handle. Okay, here's a kind of pair of poems. Then I'm going to wind this up in a minute. This will be a finite experience. But here's a poem called Forgetfulness, which is just a meditation on that state of mind. And it starts out by talking about forgetting books that you've read and forgetfulness. The name of the author is the first to go, followed immediately by the title, the plot, the heartbreaking conclusion, the entire novel, which suddenly becomes one you have never read, never even heard of. It is as if, one by one, the memories you used to harbor decided to retire to the southern hemisphere of the brain, to a little fishing village where there are no phones. Long ago, you kissed the names of the 9 muses goodbye, and you watched the quadratic equation pack its bag. And even now, as you memorize the order of the planets, something else is slipping away. The address of an uncle, a state flower, the capital of Paraguay. Whatever it is you are struggling to remember, it is not poised on the tip of your tongue, not even lurking in some obscure corner of your spleen. It has floated away down a dark mythological river whose name begins with an L, as far as you can recall. Well on your own way to oblivion, where you will join those who have forgotten even how to swim and how to ride a bicycle. No wonder you rise in the middle of the night to look up the date of a famous battle in a book on war. No wonder the moon in the window seems to have drifted out of a love poem that you used to know by heart. Thank you so much. I'm just going to read a couple more here. This is a sort of, I didn't write this with that forgetfulness poem in mind, but it seems like it plays the role of a sort of companion poem, because if the forgetfulness poem is about someone who's in the process of forgetting everything, this is about someone who remembers everything, which could be worse. You remember the 20th century, right? That was parts of it, at least. One thing you'll recall about the century is a cultural habit we had in our regard of the past. And you'll remember what we used to do is divide the past into these decade-sized little chunks, I think to make it easier to deal with this unfathomable thing called the past. So we would refer quite glibly to the 70s or the 90s or the 60s. And they would be sort of signals for, as if at midnight and New Year's Eve, everything changed, music changed, style, morality. And we were always meant to feel kind of nostalgic about the 50s, and where have they gone and all that. At any rate, that's why the poem is called Nostalgia. It's kind of a takeoff on that. Nostalgia. Remember the 1340s? We were doing a dance called the catapult. You always wore brown, the color craze of the decade. And I was draped in one of those capes that were popular, the ones with unicorns and pomegranates and needlework. Everyone would pause for beer and onions in the afternoon, and at night we would play a game called Find the Cow. Everything was hand-lettered back then, not like today. Where has the summer of 1572 gone? Brocade and sonnet marathons were the rage. We used to dress up in the flags of rival baronies and then conquer one another in cold rooms of stone. Out on the dance floor, we were all doing the struggle, while your sister practiced the Daphne, all alone in her room. We borrowed the jargon of farriers for our slang. These days, language seems transparent, a badly broken code. The 1790s will never come again. Childhood was big. People would take walks to the very tops of hills and write down what they saw in their journals without speaking. Our collars were high, our hats were extremely soft. We would surprise each other with alphabets made of twigs. It was a wonderful time to be alive, or even dead. I am very fond of the period between 1815 and 1821. Europe trembled while we sat still for our portraits. And I would love to return to 1901, if only for a moment, time enough to wind up a music box and do a few dance steps. Or shoot me back to 1922 or 1941. Or at least let me recapture the serenity of last month, when we picked berries and glided through afternoons in a canoe. Even this morning would be an improvement over the present. I was in the garden then, surrounded by the hum of bees and the Latin names of flowers, watching the early light flash off the slanted windows of the greenhouse and silver the limbs on the rows of dark hemlocks. As usual, I was thinking about the moments of the past, letting my memory rush over them like water, rushing over the stones on the bottom of a stream. I was even thinking a little about the future, that place where people are doing a dance we cannot imagine, a dance whose name we can only guess. I'll read two more poems, if that's okay. You've been very kind, indulgent audience. This was, at some point, I planned a little trip to Europe in the summer, a little summer vacation, and it turned out something went wrong, irrelevant to talk about. But so the summer was actually spent at home in the suburbs of New York, and I kind of wrote this poem to console myself for that misadventure or non-adventure, and that's why it's called Consolation. How agreeable it is not to be touring Italy this summer, wandering her cities and ascending her torrid hill towns. How much better to cruise these local familiar streets, fully grasping the meaning of every road sign and billboard, and all the sudden hand gestures of my compatriots. There are no abbeys here, no crumbling frescoes or famous domes. There is no need to memorize the succession of kings or tour the dripping corners of a dungeon, no need to stand around a sarcophagus, see Napoleon's little bed on Elba, or view the bones of a saint under glass. How much better to command the simple precinct of home than be dwarfed by pillar, arch, and basilica? Why hide my head in phrase books and wrinkled maps? Why feed scenery into a hungry, one-eyed camera, eager to eat the world one monument at a time? Instead of slouching in a cafe, ignorant of the word for ice, I will head down to the coffee shop and to the waitress known as Dot. I will slide into the flow of the morning paper, all language barriers down, rivers of idiom running freely, eggs over easy on the way. And after breakfast, I will not have to find someone willing to photograph me with my arm around the owner. I will not puzzle over the bill or record in a journal what I had to eat and how the sun came in the window. It is enough to climb back into the car as if it were the great car of English itself, and sounding my loud vernacular horn, speed off down a road that will never lead to Rome, not even Bologna. So I'll leave you with this poem. And thank you for your attention, and thank you for opening your hearts and your wallets to this great cause here, and bless you donors for supporting all this, the great good goings-on, that unambiguously good goings-on that happen under the auspices of this institution. Poem called Nightclub. I mentioned a singer named Johnny Hartman. Some of you might be too young to know about him, but he was a great jazz singer of jazz ballads. Did a kind of a desert island album with John Coltrane accompanying him on saxophone. Johnny Hartman. He comes up in the poem, and the poem is called Nightclub. You are so beautiful, and I am a fool to be in love with you, is a theme that keeps coming up in songs and poems. There seems to be no room for variation. I have never heard anyone sing, I am so beautiful, and you are a fool to be in love with me, even though this notion has surely crossed the minds of women and men alike. You are so beautiful, too bad you're a fool is another one you don't hear. Or, you are a fool to consider me beautiful. That one you will never hear, guaranteed. For no particular reason this afternoon, I am listening to Johnny Hartman, whose dark voice can curl around the concepts of love, beauty, and foolishness like no one else's can. It feels like smoke curling up from a cigarette someone left burning on a baby grand piano around 3 o'clock in the morning. Smoke that billows up into the bright lights, while out there in the darkness, some of the beautiful fools have gathered around little tables to listen, some with their eyes closed, others leaning forward into the music as if it were holding them up, or just twirling the loose ice in a glass, slipping by degrees into a rhythmic dream. Yes, there is all this foolish beauty, born beyond midnight, that has no desire to go home, especially now when everyone in the room is watching the large man with the tenor sax that hangs from his neck like a golden fish. He moves forward to the edge of the stage and hands the instrument down to me and nods that I should play. So I put the mouthpiece to my lips and blow into it with all my living breath. We are all so foolish. My long bebop solo begins by saying, so damn foolish, we have become beautiful without even knowing it. Thank you.